And he said, where did you get your authorization? Can we see the authorization for it? And he says, well, certainly. You can go down and you can look at the charter at a government location outside of Congress. You can't put this on the Senate record. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like our Trans-Pacific Partnership that's coming up for authorization this week? You're not going to be able to, we can't see how this massive trade treaty, which goes far beyond just trade. It affects copyright, it affects pharmaceuticals, it affects so many different aspects of our lives. It affects our very sovereignty. It elevates corporations to the level of governments, and it's all being done in secret. Well, that's how the NSA was created as well. It turns out they didn't have a charter. Turns out they were created by executive order, a series of executive orders by President Truman. You see, all this stuff that Obama is doing, it's accelerated. Certainly everything is accelerating. Everything is getting worse. But it is an incremental tyranny. They've been creating the legal infrastructure for this for a very long time. And it is accelerating. And it is getting much broader in its scope. I want to just read you a little bit of the back and forth between the head of the NSA and Congressman Pike, who had the committee. Congressman Pike was very upset. He said, you're talking about a document that sets up the entire NSA. It's one which all members of Congress are entitled to seeing. To which he said, no, it's got secret material in it. And he says, it seems incredible to me, frankly, we're asked to appropriate large amounts of money for a paper that we can't see how that agency is authorized. And yet that's what's going to happen this week with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We can see how it worked out for us with the NSA. Stay with us. We'll be right back with more news. We're going to be joining Paul Joseph Watson in the next hour from the UK. He's going to break down some of the news there. And I was just talking about the massive counterterrorism bill that has come out in the UK. Very frightening the way this is worded, saying basically for far too long we've been very tolerant of people who just obey the law. We've left them alone. Those days are going to end because they're going to be fine-tuning everything that you do. They're going to be looking at everything you do, analyzing everything you do, and mapping it out. That's what the thrust of the NSA has been for a very long time. Going back to 2001, remember James Clapper, the guy who was asked by Ron Wyden directly, are you doing dragnet surveillance in violation of the Constitution, in violation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act on the American public? Are you doing dragnet surveillance? And no, we're not really doing that. Now, go back to 2001, September 2001, actually. That date may sound familiar to you, 9/11. James Clapper's first directorship was Director of Geospatial Intelligence. Their directive was to map the human domain into the geographical domain, to look to see what people were doing, what they thought, who you are, who you know, what you do, and put it in a political, religious context, a cultural context. Going from nations, they said they've been looking at different nations down to different regions, and now they wanted to take it down to the individual because technology allowed them to do that. And so that's what we have when we look at the Jade Helm logo, Mastering the Human Domain. You need to understand what human domain analytics are set up for. This is really boots on the ground for the NSA. There's no other way to describe it. And, of course, it was McRaven himself, the former head of Special Forces, that sold the Special Forces 2 years ago. In 2013, he was talking about how they had to reinvent the Special Forces. People thought of them too much as kinetic operations, as jumping out of planes or fighting on the ground. They wanted to get back to their roots, back to psychological operations, to manipulating people, to ferreting out people that might be a threat to their regime, to their plans, and shutting them down beforehand. Matches perfectly with what our surveillance state is doing all over the world. Look at this story from Canada. The Harper government is retroactively rewriting their gun registry law. Well, actually, the gun registry law has been changed, and some people wanted to get access to information about it, very much like the FOIA request that we have here in America. There was a concern that if they were allowed to look at this, it might expose criminal charges against the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So what did they do? They quietly changed the law. They quietly made it illegal to look at any of those memos. So much for freedom of information. That's Canada. And of course, in Britain, they're talking about in the name of protecting the democracy there, having prior consent for anything that people are going to publish or to write about, and elevating political correctness and thought crimes to a level that we have never before seen. We've all could see this coming, but it's where it's coming. Now, of course, this next week, we're also going to have the Trans-Pacific Partnership being brought up for a vote. There was a attempt to do a to stall it by the Democrats. They shut that down. They went to cloture. They're not going to have anything beyond voting this week. They will vote for whether or not they're going to take the recommendations, this treaty that has been negotiated in secret for years by corporate lobbyists. They're going to put that before the Congress, and they say they're going to give us 2 weeks to look at it. Now, you need to understand that this is a vast new treaty, this trade agreement, and it is about many things other than trade, and it is not about free trade any more than the bailout of the big banks that collapsed the real estate markets was about free markets. No, this is crony capitalism writ large. This is legislation that has been created by these corporations. And this is something that after they show this to the Congress for 2 weeks, it'll be a straight up or down vote. There'll be no amendments, no changes allowed. But as Senator Sessions, one of the very few people who has gone to look at it because they've kept this secret. You have to, you can go in, you can read it, but you can't talk about it. You can take notes, but you can't take those notes with you. But Senator Sessions went in and talked about it in a general way. And he said, it is a living document. Once this thing is passed, they will be able to add new nations in. They will be able to change every aspect of the treaty. So if this treaty doesn't have anything in there about gun control, they can easily put this in without any further input from our legislature, from the Congress, from the Senate. So understand, there's not going to be any amendments in the 2 week period that they have to take a look at this. But after that, it can be freely changed by these corporate lobbyists. And so John Rappaport asks, he says, what law says that the text of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, must remain secret? Congress has to stay silent? Under what authority? Is there a law in the U.S. forbidding disclosure? Name that law. Can you recall anything in the Constitution that establishes secret treaties? I can't. Is there any prior treaty that states the text of all treaties can be hidden from the people? No. I can see no authority anywhere that justifies withholding the text of the TPP. Now, like I said, this is about far more than free trade. Many countries have pushed back against Big Pharma. Many of them don't have the kind of copyright protections that we have in this country, or they don't have their drugs copyrighted for as long a period of time. I want to play for you a clip from a Danish doctor comparing Big Pharma to organized crime. Here's that clip.
My name is Peter Gøtzsche. I'm a director of the Nordic Cochrane Center in Copenhagen and professor of research design and analysis at the University of Copenhagen. 2 years ago, I found out that our prescription drugs are the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. Our drugs kill around 200,000 people in America every year, and half of these people die while they do what their doctors told them. So they die because of the side effects. The other half die because of errors. And it's often the doctors that make the errors, because any drug may come with 20, 30 or 40 warnings, contraindications, precautions and so on. No doctor in the world knows about all this. So they give patients drugs that they should not have given them, that interact dangerously with other drugs or food items or so on. And then the patients die. That's the other half. So the other thing I found out 2 years ago was that much of what the drug industry does fulfills the criteria for organized crime in US law. And they behave in many ways like the mafia does. They corrupt everyone they can corrupt. They have bought every type of person, even including ministers of health in some countries. So there is a huge amount of corruption. In my country, for example, Denmark, we are regarded as having very little corruption. But yet we have thousands of doctors on industry payroll, although we are just 20,000 doctors. So this is an effective kind of corruption. The drug industry buys the professors first, then chiefs of department, then other chief physicians and so on. They don't buy junior doctors. So when several thousands are on industry payroll, it's really, really bad. And that's why I wrote my book, Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare. I hope to convince patients not to take so many drugs because so many die from the drugs they take.
Absolutely. And yet we have legislation across the country that will hold a gun to our head and force us to take vaccines, that the big pharmaceutical companies have already negotiated that they have no liability. If you haven't heard of the vaccine court, you need to look that up. They have no liability, yet they can force us to take their product, and they can withhold from us things that we want to take that are good for us. When he comes on, I want to talk to him about this new counterterrorism bill, as well as we're going to talk about the banning of cash. As Prime Minister David Cameron in the UK just recently said, for far too long we've been passively tolerant, saying to our citizens, as long as you obey the law, we'll leave you alone. We're not going to do that anymore. One of the things that they're not going to leave you alone about is just having cash. They're going to set it up so they can take your cash. This is something we see one economist after the other calling for. We've got a couple of articles up on Infowars.com. Leading German Keynesian economist calls for a cash ban. Of course, we also had the chief economist for Citibank calling for the same thing. Watson is also going to talk about an economist from the UK saying we need to ban cash and force everyone to have government-controlled bank accounts. See, this is the end game. Keynesianism has essentially been an argument that if you borrow money, it doesn't really matter because you're just borrowing it from yourself. I remember when I took economics in college, we had microeconomics and we had macroeconomics. Microeconomics were the things that you did to balance your own personal checkbook or to balance a checkbook of your company, let's say. But of course, they said when you got to the national level, none of these things mattered. Somehow, they waved a magic Keynesian wand over it, called it macroeconomics, and said, you know, the laws of the real world don't apply here. You can just borrow and print money endlessly. And of course, that was a lie. Most people knew it was a lie. Certainly the Austrian economists pointed out it was a lie. Many others. There were a lot of different economics schools that pointed out these guys were nothing but court jesters for an omnipotent state that could print money and buy people out until they get to the point where we are today. They've already taken it down to zero interest rates. They can't control that anymore. They say they've got to go into negative interest rates to try to force people to spend the money they get. But it has also brought an unforeseen, for most people, circumstance out of this, and that is the massive consolidation of wealth into the hands of a few. That's what this has always been about. It's always been about essentially putting us on an interest-only loan to the Federal Reserve. That's the scheme. And now we see that this, as we've got the consolidation of wealth in the hands of a few, as it is being consolidated into the hands of foreign countries, they are starting to take control of these assets. One of those assets is going to be cash. But they also want to be able to follow everything you do. That's what's behind the new laws in the UK. And of course, we also just mentioned in the last segment about how the Canadian government is now retroactively written some laws that would essentially open up the Freedom of Information, access to the Information Act. It's what we call the FOIA request, the Freedom of Information Act here in America. They're going to shut that down to cover up the criminal actions of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. An unprecedented movement there. And of course, we need to understand that we have to always watch the police. That's why we need transparency, because when they're not watched, we get things like this. In Chicago, remember that black site, that black torture site, Homan Square? Jakari Jackson and Joe Biggs went to cover it a few months ago because there were allegations from many people that they had been tortured. We have another one here. Chicago man. This is on Infowars.com. Chicago man says, cops brought me to a secret prison, anally raped me to force me to become an informant. Subtitle there, sadistic Chicago cops reportedly torture an innocent man. There's a video that's been obtained by The Guardian, and they say it shows him agreeing to meet them at a particular location, Al's Beef. Camera footage shows him walking over to their car with his hand extended for a handshake, unarmed, unassuming. They turn him around, push him against the car, cuff him, take him to Homan Square, where he alleges they sexually assaulted him. It says that what he says is they took their gun, they jammed it into his anus. He said, I started jerking, going crazy, going into full-blown panic mode. What did they